When a 2-year-old was led away from a shopping center in 1993, what happened next continues to disturb the UK today. What happens when children kill children? Born on March 16, 1998, to parents Denise and Ralph Bulger. Growing up in Merseyside, Liverpool, James Bulger was described as a happy, cheeky, social little boy. Just a few weeks shy of his 3rd birthday on Friday, the 12th of February 1993, James went with his mother to the new Strand Shopping Centre in Bootle. James was excitable, loudly thrashing around as Denise went to store. She bought the children a snack, hoping to quiet James down. At the butcher shop, Denise went in, leaving James by the door. Since there wasn't a queue, she thought James would be okay for a minute on his own. The butcher messed up her order, keeping Denise a little longer than she expected. Nicola, her companion, had just seen James playing with a cigarette butt by the door. When the young mother left the shop to scoop up her child, he was gone. She ran back inside flustered. "I was only in the shop a few seconds. I turned around and he'd gone," she cried. At around 3:40 p.m., whilst inside independent A.R. Tim's butcher shop on the lower floor of the center, Denise looked away from her son for just a second, distracted by the going-ons in the store. When she looked back, she quickly realized James was missing. Panic quickly rose whilst she scoured the shop for the 2-year-old boy. Denise quickly alerted the shopping center security and a search for her son began. At the same time, James and his mother were shopping. 2 other young boys from the local area were hanging around the shopping center. Robert Thompson and John Venables were 2 10-year-old boys who had decided to skip school that day, as they had done so together many times before. The 2 boys had not had the best upbringing. Born on August 23, 1982, Robert Thompson was the 5th of 7 children. His father, a tyrant who subjected Robert, his siblings, and his mother to severe physical and sexual violence, had abandoned the family early on when ran off with a woman from Stockport when Robert was just 5 years old. Ann Thompson found it hard bringing the kids up in the neighborhood. "The attitude when you live where we live is that you have to be tough or else you don't survive," she said. "When you have got people in the area threatening to blow your kneecaps off every moment of the day, that's just the way they are." After this, Ann turned to drink and drugs, even attempting suicide. Robert was left to fend for himself early on and at just 10 years old was described as street smart and clever. John Venables had a similar upbringing. John was born in Liverpool on August 13, 1982. His parents had separated early on, but his father was still in his life. The family were by no means wealthy, but compared to the Thompson household, they were significantly more comfortable. Growing up, John had an elder brother, age 13, and a 9-year-old sister. His mother, Susan, suffered from poor mental health throughout her son's childhood and frequently complained of feeling overwhelmed with parenting. Susan Venables was also accused of being a loose woman who was often seen with several different men, with John facing the brunt of the ridicule for this whilst at school. His father, Neil, an unemployed panel beater, was separated from his mother, but they lived only a mile apart, saw each other every other day, and took equal care of the children. John spent Sunday to Thursday with his mom and the rest of every week with his dad. The pair met in the school playground. They caught each other's attention by showing off in front of friends. The 2 had a lot in common, both in their home lives and schooling. Both boys were the oldest of their class, having been kept a year due to poor performance. From a distance, Robert looked like a sweet, unassuming child. He was affectionately nicknamed Chubby because of his round cherub face. Those who knew Robert would describe him as an emotional child who was prone to mood swings. He was branded as a professional truant by local police for the number of times he would skip school. Held back a year, he was barely literate. "I can't read hard words," he said. On the days he was at school, he had a knack for stirring things up. He would call people names and get them to chase him. Few had the patience to be friends with him, only his younger brother and a couple of lads who lived nearby. But then, the whole of Robert's family was a bit like that. Shunned, outcast, the butt of local criticism, and very well known to police. On the other hand, John was the least of his parents' worries at the time. He was no stranger to respite care, and he and his siblings regularly went on weekends away to give his parents a break. John struggled academically but was considered bright enough. He tried hard in school but struggled to keep up with his classmates. He often missed out on breaks and lunches at school to stay in the classroom to finish off from the lesson before. He was subject to ridicule by his peers and would frequently come home in tears. One neighbor described him as perfectly well behaved and spoke of one incident where he once came to me crying, saying the other boys were picking on him, trying to steal his bike. Fed up with the bullying, John became more vocal and violent, trying to vent his frustration. One outburst led to John being suspended from school for attempting to throttle his classmate with a ruler. A teacher described the incident as the worst case of school violence she had witnessed. As a result of this incident, John was placed in another school. Initially, all reports suggest that his behavior and academic success improved in the first year since the move. He made good friends and was doing well in class. Nevertheless, in September 1991, John's success took a sharp turn for the worse when he was moved class. Sitting in the new class was a chubby boy with a cherub's face, Robert Thompson. By the time Robert Thompson and John Venables skipped school together on February 12, 1993, the two boys were good friends and were known locally as a pair of troublemakers. Throughout the day, John and Robert were seen shoplifting from various stores throughout the center, including sweets, a troll doll, batteries, and a can of blue paint. At one point during the day, John and Robert found themselves inside the department store, T.J. Hughes. Inside, a woman noticed that the two boys were trying to get their children's attention. Suspicious but not distrusting of the unassuming boys, she turned away. Moments later, her 3-year-old daughter and 2-year-old son were nowhere to be seen. Frantically, she searched the store and quickly found her daughter, but her son was nowhere to be seen. She asked her daughter where her brother was, to which she replied that he had gone outside with the boy. Running outside, she saw John Venables and Robert Thompson, beckoning her son to follow them. When John saw the boy's mother, they quickly ran away and told the boy to go back to his mother. Their plan was thwarted, but another child's fate was sealed. Soon after the failed attempt to abduct the boy minutes before, the two were hanging around a sweet kiosk when they noticed James Bulger by the door of a nearby butcher shop. With Bulger's mother Denise momentarily distracted, they got the toddler to come with them, taking him by the hand and leading him away, out of the shopping center and away from the protection of his mother. The moment the 10-year-old boys led James away was caught on CCTV at 15:42. John and Robert took Bulger to the Leeds and Liverpool Canal, around a quarter of a mile from the new Strand Shopping Centre. The three boys then began to walk over 5 kilometers across Liverpool. Later, over 40 witnesses reported that they had seen the older boys with their 2-year-old captive, who was said to have been crying his eyes out after he was dropped on his face by the two as they led him out of the center. Out of all 40 witnesses, nobody did anything. Nobody reported the oddness of the situation. Just 2 people challenged John and Robert on what they were doing with the small crying and injured child. The 10-year-olds told the two that James was their younger brother and they were going to the police station for help after he had fallen over and injured himself. This seemed plausible to the 2 witnesses, and there was a police station just a short distance away from where they were stopped. Given that their story seemed genuine, the pair were able to continue with the 2-year-old, and the witnesses went on about that day, a day they would regret not changing their actions on for the rest of their lives. From here, the real nightmare begins for James Bulger. Eventually, the boys arrived in the village of Walton between 5:45 and 6:30 p.m., where chillingly, Walton Lane Police Station was facing across the road from them. Instead of turning the child in and ending it there, the pair led James Bulger up a steep bank to a railway line near a disused Walton and Anfield railway station. It was here, on the train tracks, that John Venables and Robert Thompson began to torture the 2-year-old boy. It is not known who started the attack, but one of the boys threw some of the blue paint they'd previously stolen from the shopping center into James's left eye, where he began screaming in pain. They then kicked him, pummeled him with bricks and stones, and stuffed batteries into his mouth and anus. Finally, the boys hit Bulger over the head with a 22-pound iron bar, which resulted in 10 skull fractures. All in all, Bulger sustained 42 injuries to his face, head, and body. He was so badly battered, authorities later concluded that there was no way to tell which injury presented the fatal blow. Eventually, Venables and Thompson placed Bulger's dead body. A forensic pathologist later concluded that he was dead at this point, across the train tracks, in hopes of making the whole thing look like an accident, and abandoned the scene before a train came along and severed the toddler in 2. Searches for the 2-year-old had already begun, and his disappearance made national evening news, and tips and witness statements flooded into the police. The investigation led detectives immediately into the village of Walton, where he had been placed by eyewitnesses. One report told police that James had been seen by the canal and plans were made to have a team of divers search the waters. While searches were going on, Denise and Ralph were immediately suspected by police and were subjected to questioning. As with most child abductions, the parents or immediate family are usually the first suspected. Denise went through the events of the day with detectives, tracing her steps right up until walking into the butcher's. Just after midnight, police obtained the CCTV footage from the shopping center and trawled through it in hope of spotting where the 2-year-old had disappeared to. Despite the low-quality video, it was clear to investigators that 2 small boys could be seen leading James Bulger to the exit. Once those CCTV images were released to the media, the search for the 2-year-old intensified. When James's father saw that it was just 2 boys with his son when he had left the shopping center, he was initially relieved and would later say, "I looked at Denise and smiled with relief. He's gonna be all right, Denise. He's with 2 young kids. He's gonna be all right." The disappearance of the 2-year-old was impossible to miss. The news was everywhere. Mothers suspected their sons. The families on estates close by refused to let their kids out to play. Animosity grew between neighbors as everyone pointed their fingers at each other. Ann Thompson asked Robert outright if that was him on the CCTV footage, but he denied even being at the shopping center that day. This didn't alleviate Ann's fears, and she confided in a friend about her worries that it was her son in the video, even going so far as threatening to take Robert to the police herself. 2 days after James Bulger disappeared on Sunday, 14th February, a train engineer noticed something on the tracks that looked like a doll. At first, it didn't strike him as unusual. Neighborhood kids routinely laid things on the tracks. A couple of hours later, a group of local boys went up to the train tracks to look for lost footballs they could play with when they saw what they too believed to be a broken doll. When they got closer, they saw the sickening scene and the alarm was raised. All trains were stopped and police roped off the area. James Bulger's body was severed. His clothing, which had been removed from the waist down, was laid near his head. His underwear was covered with blood. Police found a heavy 2-foot-long iron bar, bricks, and stones all soaked with blood close by, as well as 3 AA batteries and a tin of blue paint. Although the autopsy was inconclusive when attempting to establish if there was any kind of sexual assault, investigators believe that some of the injuries below the waist indicated sexual assault, although this has never been proven. As the murder investigation began, a woman contacted the police and reported that her friend Susan Venable's son had skipped school on the day James was taken, and when he returned, she saw a blue paint stain on his jacket sleeve. She went on to tell the police that she believed Venables had been with his friend Robert Thompson on that day, and he had also missed school, and the pair looked similar to the boys on the CCTV. Following this tip, police brought the 10-year-olds in for questioning. On Thursday, February 18th at 7:30 a.m., 4 police officers came to the Thompson home with a search warrant. The police seized all of Robert's clothes and immediately noticed the blood on his shoes. Later in the day, the police arrived at Venable's home with another search warrant. When Susan answered the door and saw the police, she said, "I knew you'd be here. I told him you'd want to see him for bunking school on Friday." She also told the police that her son had come home on Friday with his coat covered in paint. The police seized the coat and saw the stain of the paint, and more chillingly, a small handprint on the sleeve. When John realized what was happening, he sank into hysterics, saying, "I don't want to go to prison. Mom, I didn't kill the baby. It's that Robert Thompson. He always gets me into trouble." The pair were interviewed separately, with John taken to the Lower Lane Police Station and Robert at the Walton Lane Police Station. Police took blood, hair, and fingernail samples from both boys as well as fingerprint samples, which interested John to find it. You leave these on whatever you touch. If you touch someone's skin, does it have a fingerprint? If you drag someone really hard, do you leave your fingernails in his skin? In the initial interviews, both of the boys denied everything. But as the week went on, and as they became more distraught, they started to admit bits, but claimed the other was the instigator. In a haunting interview, Robert is said to have asked police whether the 2-year-old had been taken to hospital to get him alive again. He didn't appear to understand the finiteness of what he had done. Forensic tests confirmed that the same blue paint found on James's body matched the stains on the 10-year-old's clothing. As well as this, both boys had blood on their footwear, with the blood on Robert's shoe being matched to James through DNA. A pattern of bruising on Bulger's right cheek matched the features of the upper part of shoes worn by Robert. A paint mark in the toe cap of one of the Venable shoes indicated he must have used some force when he kicked James. Just a week after the death of James Bulger, Robert Thompson and John Venables were charged with the murder and appeared at South Sefton Youth Court, where they were remanded in custody to await trial. John was hyperventilating during the hearing and could not participate in the police lineups due to his distress. The trial began on the 24th of November 1993 at Preston Court. The 2 boys were too small to see over the railings, so a special raised platform had to be built in order for them to see the proceedings. Robert showed little emotion throughout the trial and was assumed by onlookers to be the guilty one of the two. Robert had no family attend the trial and sat next to a social worker. John was constantly looking back at his mother for reassurance, looking anxious and scared throughout. Whatever the public perception was of the two, the prosecution was out to prove that both of them were equally responsible for James's death. Because of their young age, the prosecution had to prove that they knew that their actions were wrong. The jury was shown several pieces of evidence: photos of the crime, the CCTV, blood-splattered bricks, stones, clothing, the tin of blue paint, and the iron bar. After just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury found Robert Thompson and John Venables guilty of the murder of James Bulger. John sobbed as the verdict was read, whilst Robert showed no reaction. The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Moreland, spoke directly to the boys, saying, "The killing of James Bulger was an act of unparalleled evil and barbarity. This child of 2 was taken from his mother on a journey of over 2 miles and then, on the railway line, was battered to death without mercy. Then his body was placed across the railway line so it would be run over by a train in an attempt to conceal his murder. In my judgment, your conduct was both cunning and very wicked. This sentence that I pass upon you both is that you should be detained during Her Majesty's pleasure, in such a place and under such conditions as the Secretary of State may now decide. You will be securely detained for very, very many years until the Home Secretary is satisfied that you have matured and are fully rehabilitated, and until you are no longer a danger." Justice Moreland also allowed both boys, who had only been referred to as Boy A and Boy B so far in the press, to be named. They were sentenced to a minimum period of imprisonment of 8 years, which was later raised upon review. At the age of 18, John Venables and Robert Thompson were released in June 2001. The pair were given new identities and lifelong anonymity due to the fear of vigilante action, much of the uproar of the UK. Since their release, the two have taken vastly different paths. Though Robert was believed to have been the main instigator of the murder, since his release, he has never reoffended and by all accounts is in a stable relationship with a man who is fully aware of who he is. John Venables, on the other hand, has been remanded back to prison time and time again, most notably after being caught with child pornography and a pedophile manual, which described how to abuse young girls. John Venables also had to be reissued with a new identity after allowing his to leak when he bragged about who he was to friends. Most recently, John Venables was denied parole in September 2020 and told he'd have to wait 2 more years before he'd be eligible for parole again. So what's your opinion? Do the 2 child killers deserve to be free to live new lives? Is rehabilitation in such brutal instances like these possible? Leave your thoughts below.